Under the ruins of post-World War I Germany, a new ideological order began to form, one that blended politics, nationalism, and faith into a single, inseparable structure. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, not only crippled Germany's economy, but also fractured its national identity. Millions of citizens viewed the treaty as an unjust humiliation, stripping away not just territory and resources, but dignity. This collective resentment became fertile ground for a movement that promised redemption and renewal. Into this atmosphere of loss and longing stepped Adolf Hitler, who understood better than most that ideas alone were not enough to mobilize a nation. They needed symbols, myths, and rituals that could touch the soul. The German people were no strangers to propaganda. During the First World War, the state had already experimented with state-controlled messaging to sustain morale. But the defeat of 1918 and the chaotic Weimar years that followed created a deep disillusionment with rational politics. Many Germans, weary of democratic instability, inflation, and the threat of communist uprisings, turned toward emotional and spiritual explanations for their suffering. Nationalism, increasingly framed in moral and metaphysical terms, became not merely a political belief, but a path toward collective salvation. The early National Socialist movement, emerging from the fringes of Munich in the early 1920s, recognized that the German nation could be reshaped not only through military force, but through belief. The Nazi Party's propaganda apparatus, still primitive in its early years, relied heavily on rallies, speeches, and the visual power of symbols, the swastika, the eagle, the uniform, to transform abstract ideology into a tangible experience. These were not mere political tools. They were designed to evoke feelings of awe and belonging. The swastika itself, drawn from ancient Indo-European imagery, was recast as a sacred emblem of racial purity and destiny. Joseph Goebbels, who would later become the Minister of Propaganda, articulated the key principle: propaganda must not just inform, it must transform. He envisioned a total system of communication where art, architecture, cinema, and even religion itself served the same unified purpose: to create faith in the Führer and his mission. The idea of Glauben, belief, replaced reason as the moral foundation of the new German state. To believe in Hitler became synonymous with believing in Germany's resurrection. In the early 1930s, this transformation of propaganda into a quasi-religious force coincided with the broader collapse of faith in traditional institutions. The church, divided and uncertain, struggled to compete with the seductive certainty of National Socialism. Nazi rhetoric appropriated religious language: sacrifice, redemption, purity, destiny. Hitler's speeches invoked the providence guiding his mission, while state ceremonies borrowed heavily from Christian forms: processions, hymns, light symbolism. The annual Nuremberg rallies, meticulously staged and choreographed, resembled massive liturgical events, complete with banners, torchlight, and chants that synchronized thousands of voices into one. To the average citizen, these spectacles offered a sense of participation in something vast and eternal. The war to come was not yet visible, but its moral foundation was being laid. The idea of the nation as a living organism, pure, chosen, under threat, became central to the Nazi worldview. Dying for the Reich was presented not as a military necessity, but as a sacred duty. The soldier was no longer just a combatant. He was a disciple, a guardian of faith. By the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, the boundaries between religion and politics had all but disappeared in official discourse. Propaganda became the state's theology, and its rituals replaced prayer. The radio, the press, and the cinema were not merely communication channels, they were pulpits. The Nazi message did not call for reflection, but for submission. It demanded not understanding, but belief. What began as a political movement evolved into a system of total devotion, in which the Führer was not only a leader, but the embodiment of destiny itself. The foundation for this ideological transformation, from nationalism to faith, was not built overnight. It relied on decades of social frustration, intellectual erosion, and emotional manipulation. The propaganda that followed would turn these foundations into an entire spiritual architecture of war, convincing millions that to fight conquer, and die was not only patriotic, but divine. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, propaganda became the central pillar of the new regime's control. Within weeks, Joseph Goebbels established the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, a vast bureaucratic machine designed to shape every aspect of public life. Its task was not limited to spreading messages. It sought to regulate what Germans could see, hear, read, and even feel. The press, radio, film, theater, literature, and visual arts were all integrated into one coordinated system. This was not a ministry of communication. It was a ministry of faith production. Every citizen was to be enveloped by a single, consistent worldview that elevated Hitler's authority to the level of divine inevitability. The new propaganda ministry inherited a nation already conditioned by years of economic hardship and national humiliation. Goebbels recognized that the key to control was not coercion alone, but emotional mobilization. He famously declared that the most brilliant propaganda is that which makes people believe they are acting on their own conviction. Through newspapers like Völkischer Beobachter and radio broadcasts of Hitler's speeches, the state fused personal sentiment with collective purpose. The Führer's voice became omnipresent, calm, paternal, yet absolute. In every speech he invoked destiny, portraying himself not as a politician, but as a vessel of national will. Public rituals soon became extensions of this spiritual framework. The first major display came with the 1933 Day of Potsdam, which symbolically united the old Prussian monarchy with the new Nazi state. In the Garrison Church, before the tomb of Frederick the Great, President Hindenburg and Hitler bowed to each other, the image transmitted across the Reich. The event was staged with religious solemnity, banners, church bells, and a mass of uniformed youth singing hymns of rebirth. It marked the moment when traditional faith and militarized nationalism merged into one visual theology. The regime's control over the media transformed communication into liturgy. Radio ownership was expanded through the production of the Volksempfänger, a cheap standardized receiver that allowed Goebbels' ministry to reach millions. Broadcasts of speeches, parades, and military reviews were designed to synchronize emotions nationwide. The voice from Berlin became the nation's conscience, and silence and dissent became a kind of blasphemy. Newsreels such as Die Deutsche Wochenschau played before films, ensuring that even leisure time served ideological immersion. Propaganda art filled the spaces of daily life with symbolic clarity. Posters and sculptures depicted idealized Aryan figures, strong, pure, and obedient. Painters like Adolf Ziegler and sculptors such as Arno Breker glorified the human form as divine perfection, echoing classical aesthetics yet stripped of individuality. The body became an altar of racial purity, and the soldier, its priest. Even architecture served this sacred narrative. Albert Speer's monumental designs for rallies and buildings used columns of light and vast symmetrical spaces to evoke transcendence. At Nuremberg, Speer's Cathedral of Light transformed political assembly into a vision of eternal unity. Religion itself became increasingly subordinated to the cult of the nation. While Germany remained formally Christian, the Nazi Party cultivated its own pseudo-spiritual substitutes. The German faith movement, encouraged by some within the regime, sought to create a faith grounded in racial mysticism and ancestral worship. Christian holidays were reinterpreted, Christmas celebrated as a festival of Aryan purity, Easter as a symbol of rebirth for the nation. The cross was gradually overshadowed by the swastika, and sermons that once praised God now praised the Führer as the savior of Germany's soul. Through education and youth organizations, propaganda reached the next generation with missionary zeal. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls became temples of indoctrination, where obedience was framed as faith and sacrifice as sacred duty. Schoolbooks replaced moral parables with stories of racial triumph and heroism. Children were taught that the highest virtue was loyalty to the nation, and that dying for Germany was an act of grace. By the mid-1930s, entire generations were growing up not as citizens of a republic, but as believers in a divine national destiny. As the regime tightened its grip, the transformation of war into religion took its most potent form. the myth of eternal struggle. Hitler's speeches declared that peace was weakness, that life itself was a battleground ordained by nature. In this worldview, every German became both a participant and a worshipper in a cosmic conflict between light and darkness, framed not in moral terms, but racial and spiritual ones. The stage was set for a war that would be fought not only with weapons, but with faith. By the late 1930s, Nazi propaganda had evolved into a complete ideological system, a fusion of politics, myth, and ritual that no longer required persuasion. It simply defined reality. Under Goebbels' direction, the Ministry of Propaganda turned every cultural output into a sermon, and every citizen into both listener and participant. Films, architecture, literature, and even scientific conferences reflected the sacred narrative of the Reich, the belief that Germany was chosen to restore balance to a corrupt world. This faith-based nationalism was not imposed solely through fear, but maintained through a powerful sense of belonging. For millions, obedience became a form of worship. The regime's cultural propaganda drew heavily on the language and structure of religion. Hitler himself often used biblical rhythm in his speeches. He spoke not as a statesman, but as a prophet proclaiming revelation. His autobiography, Mein Kampf, served as scripture. Its ideas were memorized and cited as moral doctrine. The Führerprinzip, or leader principle, transformed political loyalty into spiritual devotion. To doubt Hitler was not a political disagreement, it was heresy. This principle penetrated every aspect of German society, from the army and the bureaucracy to classrooms and family life. It established a moral order where faith in leadership replaced personal conscience. Goebbels refined this spiritualization of authority through repetition and aesthetic unity. Every message, no matter how trivial, reinforced the same emotional tone: pride, destiny, and purity. He understood that consistency was more persuasive than logic. The population was not expected to think critically. They were expected to feel collectively. Posters and radio programs framed Hitler as a messianic figure sent by Providence to redeem Germany from chaos. His image appeared in schools, factories, and private homes, often replacing religious icons. The slogan, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one Reich, one leader, became not just political propaganda, but a creed. The process of transforming war into religion advanced further through the glorification of sacrifice. Military service was elevated beyond patriotic duty. The soldier was depicted as a martyr who offered his life for the eternal Reich. The Nazi mythos drew upon ancient Germanic symbolism, the warrior cults, the pagan reverence for blood and soil, to sanctify violence. The term Blut und Boden, blood and soil, carried theological undertones. Blood as sacred lineage, soil as holy land. Fighting and dying for these symbols was described as fulfilling divine law. This transformation blurred the line between battlefield and altar. Cinematic propaganda became one of the most effective tools in embedding these beliefs. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph des Willens, Triumph of the Will, released in 1935, immortalized the Nuremberg Rally not as a political event, but as a transcendental ceremony. The camera's low angles, sweeping panoramas, and orchestrated marches created a sense of divine order descending upon humanity. The film's imagery of light breaking through clouds as Hitler's plane landed became iconic, a visual metaphor of revelation. Millions of Germans saw the film, and many did not perceive it as propaganda, but as proof that destiny was unfolding before their eyes. At the same time, the press reinforced the notion that Germany's enemies were not just political adversaries, but moral corruptors, forces of chaos seeking to destroy divine order. Propaganda publications depicted Bolshevism and Judaism as demonic opposites of the Aryan spirit. The conflict between Germany and its supposed enemies was presented as a cosmic struggle between good and evil. This theological framing allowed violence to be seen not as aggression, but purification. The coming war, when it arrived, would not be fought for conquest alone, but as a crusade for spiritual survival. The synchronization of society, known as Gleichschaltung, ensured that every institution echoed this message. Universities aligned research with ideology. Historians reinterpreted the past as a prophecy of Hitler's rise. Even the sciences were infused with metaphysical purpose. Racial biology and eugenics became modern sacraments, promising to cleanse the nation's body as faith cleansed its soul. The concept of racial hygiene was elevated from pseudoscience to divine mission, a justification for persecution, sterilization, and, eventually, annihilation. In this world of orchestrated belief, propaganda ceased to be a tool and became an environment. There was no longer a distinction between faith and fact. The German people, surrounded by symbols of destiny and sacrifice, began to perceive history itself as revelation, one that demanded their participation. The nation's political ambitions were transfigured into moral duty, and war became the inevitable culmination of this faith. When it finally came in 1939, the invasion of Poland was not introduced as an act of aggression, but as the fulfillment of prophecy. Germans marched into battle believing they were instruments of history's sacred design, convinced that victory was not merely possible, but preordained. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Nazi propaganda entered its most powerful phase. War itself became a sacred act. From the first radio broadcasts announcing the campaign, the conflict was framed not as aggression, but as a moral crusade. Goebbels declared that Germany was defending civilization from chaos and corruption. Hitler's proclamation to the German people spoke of the struggle forced upon us by fate and invoked divine justice as the source of the nation's strength. The invasion was presented not in strategic or political terms, but as a fulfillment of destiny, a righteous battle ordained by history. The machinery of propaganda transformed every victory, setback, and loss into a spiritual parable. Films and newsreels documented German troops marching through Poland, not as conquerors, but as liberators restoring divine order. The destruction of Warsaw was reframed as punishment for resistance against truth. This language of purification, the same used in domestic propaganda about race and culture, now extended to entire nations. Military operations were sacralized, their brutality concealed beneath symbols of redemption and renewal. The home front, too, was absorbed into this ritualized worldview. Goebbels' ministry maintained a continuous rhythm of ceremony. Radio speeches, parades, films, and illustrated magazines reminded citizens that each bomb dropped and each soldier fallen were offerings to the Reich. Loss was no longer tragedy. It was transcendence. Mothers who received telegrams of death were told their sons had joined the eternal ranks of Germany. Churches held joint services where the swastika and the cross appeared side by side, merging martyrdom and patriotism into one emotional narrative. In the military, this belief system reinforced discipline and obedience. Soldiers were taught that they served not only the state, but a cosmic cause. The Wehrmacht's ideological training integrated racial and religious imagery into its instruction. Commanders framed campaigns as divine missions, to cleanse Europe, to redeem the land, to secure the future of the Aryan race. Chaplains, though technically Christian, often echoed Nazi theological language, portraying Hitler as the chosen instrument of providence. The result was a moral landscape where doubt equaled betrayal, and death in battle promised immortality. Propaganda during the early war years perfected its aesthetic of triumph. Leni Riefenstahl's Tag der Freiheit and other military documentaries glorified order, motion, and unity. The camera lingered on faces of soldiers gazing upward, as though receiving divine revelation. The rituals of war, salutes, flags, marches, became indistinguishable from worship. The front line was portrayed as a temple where the faith of the German people was tested and renewed. The same imagery appeared in the press, depicting battlefields bathed in light, suggesting divine favor upon the Reich's arms. Behind this spectacle lay an increasingly total system of belief management. Propaganda shaped not only what Germans thought, but how they felt time and history itself. Every victory was eternalized, every defeat reinterpreted as trial or purification. Goebbels' speeches described the war as Ein Heiliger Krieg, a holy war, fought not for wealth or territory, but for the soul of mankind. The vocabulary of religion, now stripped of its theological roots, served political necessity. Germans were told they were chosen instruments in a global battle between faith and nihilism. In occupied territories, this ideology justified violence as spiritual cleansing. The propaganda aimed at soldiers and administrators described the East as a land of darkness, awaiting enlightenment through German rule. Orders from the High Command spoke of struggle for civilization and restoration of divine law. The concept of Lebensraum, living space, was preached not as expansionism, but as fulfillment of natural destiny. Posters and pamphlets invoked imagery of rebirth, portraying conquest as resurrection. By 1940, as the Wehrmacht triumphed across Western Europe, the quasi-religious nature of propaganda reached its zenith. The fall of France was celebrated in mass ceremonies, with church bells and fireworks marking the Day of Deliverance. Newspapers compared Hitler to historic redeemers, Frederick the Great, Charlemagne, even Christ, blending national pride with messianic imagery. The regime orchestrated pilgrimages to battlefield monuments and graveyards, turning them into sacred sites. The dead were no longer mourned but venerated, their memory fueling an ever deeper commitment to total war. This spiritualization of conflict created a society incapable of distinguishing faith from fanaticism. To question the war was not to disagree with policy. It was to reject destiny itself. In this environment, propaganda achieved what no totalitarian system had before. It erased the boundary between belief and obedience. Germany no longer merely fought wars, it worshipped them. The state had become the church, and the battlefield its altar. As the war expanded across Europe, Nazi propaganda deepened its religious framework, transforming the conflict into an apocalyptic struggle between sacred order and demonic chaos. With each campaign, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, France, the tone of official communication grew more messianic. Victory was no longer described as strategic success, but as divine affirmation. Each conquest reinforced the myth that Germany was fulfilling a cosmic design. Goebbels' ministry carefully controlled the narrative. Soldiers were apostles, battles were revelations, and Hitler remained the infallible prophet leading humanity toward renewal. The Blitzkrieg itself was sanctified through language and imagery. Rapid mechanized warfare, supported by air supremacy, was portrayed as the manifestation of divine precision, lightning from heaven. Propaganda films and illustrated magazines referred to it as the hand of God of the Führer. Every tank advance and aerial bombardment became part of a grand choreography symbolizing destiny's unstoppable momentum. The mechanical harmony of war was aestheticized as proof of divine favor, fusing technology and spirituality into one doctrine of power. For civilians, propaganda became liturgy. Radio broadcasts carried daily devotional segments, mixing news with ideological reflection. Newspapers opened with quotations from Hitler's speeches, treated as sacred text. Teachers began morning lessons by having students recite oaths to the Führer, while workers in factories stood for the playing of martial hymns before beginning their shifts. The rhythm of everyday life synchronized with the rhythm of belief. The Reich's calendar was filled with ritual observances, anniversaries of victories, Hitler's birthday, and days of heroes, replacing Christian holidays with state ceremonies that glorified death and duty. By 1941, as Germany prepared for its most ambitious campaign, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the spiritual dimension of propaganda intensified. Operation Barbarossa was presented as the ultimate holy war. Hitler's declaration on June 22nd described it as a crusade against Bolshevik atheism and the forces of darkness. Posters and pamphlets distributed to soldiers framed the conflict as a fight for the survival of civilization, drawing parallels to the Teutonic Knights and medieval Christendom. The enemy was dehumanized not merely politically, but metaphysically. Soviet soldiers were portrayed as godless entities, soulless instruments of evil. On the Eastern Front, this faith-driven narrative shaped both motivation and behavior. Soldiers were told they fought for the eternal future of the Aryan race, for divine justice and the preservation of sacred land. chaplains and propaganda officers circulated leaflets invoking the idea of holy fire cleansing the East. The destruction of cities and the persecution of civilians were rationalized as acts of purification. This spiritual veneer allowed violence to appear righteous, even merciful in its supposed historical necessity. At home, Goebbels ensured that reports from the front maintained the aura of divine inevitability. Radio bulletins announced victories with solemn musical preludes, resembling religious services. When casualties mounted, he reframed suffering as sacrifice. The blood of our soldiers is the seed of the future Reich. Death became the ultimate expression of faith. The cult of the fallen intensified, with memorial services featuring torches, hymns, and invocations of eternal unity. In every speech, Goebbels emphasized that those who died for Germany did not perish. They were absorbed into the eternal body of the nation. Even defeat could be recast as martyrdom. When the Luftwaffe failed to subdue Britain in 1940, propaganda shifted the narrative from conquest to endurance. The Reich's resilience under air raids was portrayed as a test of divine strength. Films like Feuertaufe depicted German pilots not as victims but as chosen warriors enduring trials set by Providence. Goebbels' ministry mastered this reinterpretation of reality. Victory proved divine justice, and loss proved divine testing. In either case, belief deepened. The intertwining of faith and warfare reached the highest levels of symbolism through architecture and ceremony. Albert Speer's monumental projects, the Great Hall of Berlin, the Zeppelinfeld at Nuremberg, were conceived as temples for a future empire that would last 1,000 years. Military parades beneath colossal banners resembled processions of a new world religion. Light columns and torchlit rallies evoked transcendence, turning political gatherings into sacraments of loyalty. By 1942, as the war grew more brutal, propaganda no longer sought to persuade. It commanded belief. Every defeat was explained as part of divine design, every atrocity as fulfillment of moral duty. The regime had succeeded in merging nationalism, religion, and death into a single faith system. War was not merely fought, it was worshipped. Germany's soldiers and civilians alike lived within a total spiritual theater, where every act of obedience affirmed the Reich's cosmic mission. What began as propaganda had become revelation, and the war itself, a liturgy written in blood. By the middle of 1942, as the war turned toward global scale, the Nazi regime intensified its efforts to preserve faith in the inevitability of victory. The catastrophic winter in Russia, the Allied bombing of German cities, and the first major defeats threatened not only the army's strength, but also the spiritual foundation of the Reich. Propaganda was forced to evolve, from triumphal exultation to apocalyptic perseverance. Goebbels redefined belief itself. Victory was no longer proof of divine favor, but endurance amid suffering became its truest expression. The war cult entered its mature phase, where pain, loss, and sacrifice became sacred duties binding the nation together. The collapse of the offensive near Moscow and the prolonged battles on the Eastern Front required a new emotional architecture. Goebbels framed the struggle as the Fate War, an ordeal sent by Providence to test the German people's worthiness. Speeches and pamphlets drew parallels to Christian martyrdom, yet without invoking forgiveness or humility. Instead, they emphasized submission to destiny. The rhetoric of purification grew harsher. Germany was depicted as the chosen nation enduring trial by fire, while enemies represented the unholy alliance of corruption and decay. Every bomb that fell on Berlin or Hamburg was reinterpreted as a crucible in which the new order would be forged. Inside the Reich, the propaganda apparatus achieved near-total integration. The press operated under uniform direction. Even small-town editors received daily guidelines from Goebbels' ministry. Radio broadcasts repeated the same refrains: faith, endurance, unity. Newsreels blurred reality and ritual. Images of burning cities alternated with soldiers kneeling in prayer, or civilians rebuilding ruins under banners declaring Gott mit uns. The consistency of tone was absolute. The message was not rational persuasion, but hypnotic reinforcement, belief maintained through rhythm and repetition. In the face of defeat, Hitler's image became ever more divine. Paintings, posters, and films portrayed him not as a political leader, but as a martyr savior who suffered alongside his people. Artists depicted his gaze turned upward, haloed by light, echoing Christian iconography. The narrative of betrayal, by generals, by weak hearts, by foreign conspiracies, reinforced his isolation and purity. The Führer was now the Christ of the Reich, misunderstood, persecuted, yet unyielding. His supposed infallibility shielded him from responsibility. Failures were always the fault of others, or the will of destiny. As the army suffered at Stalingrad, Goebbels orchestrated the largest emotional campaign of the war. Newspapers and radio described the encircled Sixth Army not as doomed, but as sanctified. The soldiers' endurance was mythologized as a testament of faith. In broadcasts, Goebbels spoke of men whose names will live forever in the heart of the nation. When the surrender finally occurred in February 1943, propaganda refused to acknowledge defeat. It became a story of transfiguration. The soldiers did not fall, they ascended into legend. The event was reframed as the ultimate act of sacrifice, proving Germany's divine mission. The emotional weight of Stalingrad prepared the nation for total war. Goebbels' famous Sportpalast speech on February 18, 1943, invoked religious imagery throughout. "Do you believe in the Führer?" he asked the crowd, echoing a preacher demanding faith from his congregation. The ecstatic cries of "Yes" were broadcast across the Reich. The rally was staged like a mass, banners, orchestral preludes, lighting designed to illuminate the faces of believers. In that moment, the line between sermon and propaganda disappeared completely. The war was no longer a political event. It had become an act of worship. Daily life reflected this theology of survival. Posters declared, "Faith is our weapon. Sacrifice is victory. The Führer gives his life for Germany. Give yours." Religious ceremonies subtly merged with political ones. Priests prayed for victory using Nazi slogans, and funerals of soldiers became semi-official rites combining Christian liturgy with fascist iconography. Schools taught children that dying for the Reich meant eternal life in history's memory. The idea of immortality through obedience replaced salvation through grace. Meanwhile, films and literature presented suffering as redemptive beauty. Productions like Kohlberg, 1945, commissioned during Germany's final collapse, celebrated self-sacrifice to the point of annihilation. In its scenes of townspeople choosing death over surrender, propaganda reached its purest form, the glorification of destruction as moral triumph. Every citizen was urged to see endurance as prayer, death as devotion, and loyalty as the final sacrament. By the peak of the war, Germany had become a temple of perpetual mobilization. Propaganda's evolution from persuasion to religion was complete. It required no argument, only faith. The Nazi state had successfully replaced theology with ideology, liturgy with spectacle, and salvation with conquest. In the ruins of Europe, the idea of divine war had found its most absolute expression, a faith so consuming that it demanded not belief in life, but worship of death. As 1943 turned into 1944, the structure of Nazi propaganda changed once again. Germany's situation had grown desperate. The Eastern Front was collapsing, the Allies had landed in Italy, and the bombing of German cities had become relentless. Yet, rather than retreat into realism, the regime doubled down on transcendence. The more the Reich disintegrated, the more its propaganda portrayed the war as a spiritual apocalypse. Defeat was not possible within this worldview. It could only be interpreted as purification before renewal. Goebbels' ministry no longer aimed to convince, it sought to maintain a collective trance. The war became a ritual of faith, performed by a nation convinced that its suffering had cosmic meaning. The destruction of cities such as Hamburg, Cologne, and later Dresden was framed as martyrdom. Newsreels showing the ruins emphasized resilience rather than loss. Narrators spoke of cities reborn in fire and the eternal flame of loyalty. Religious imagery returned with greater intensity. Ashes were compared to baptismal water, and ruins were described as altars of rebirth. Propaganda art portrayed bombed skylines beneath divine light, transforming devastation into revelation. In this visual theology, destruction proved not weakness, but moral strength. Citizens clearing rubble were presented as participants in sacred reconstruction, their labor sanctified as an act of worship. Within the military, faith-based propaganda targeted soldiers facing hopeless battles. The Eastern Front was depicted as the frontier between light and darkness, where German soldiers held back the forces of chaos. Leaflets and radio bulletins spoke of holy ground defended by the faithful. Even as entire divisions were destroyed, reports from the propaganda companies, military journalists embedded at the front, described the dead as guardians of eternity. By 1944, the distinction between heroism and sacrifice had disappeared. Death itself became the measure of devotion. In the occupied territories, the same ideological pattern justified escalating violence. Propaganda for the SS and police units framed the extermination of enemies as both moral and hygienic necessity. Terms such as cleansing, purification, and holy duty infused bureaucratic orders with spiritual overtones. Goebbels' ministry avoided explicit details, but cultivated an atmosphere in which extermination was seen as destiny. The perpetrators of genocide were told they were agents of cosmic balance, purifying the world for the coming 1,000-year Reich. On the home front, the total war narrative became a substitute religion. The radio replaced the church bell. The voice of the Führer replaced the sermon. Hitler's rare public appearances were treated as pilgrimages, moments of revelation. His image grew increasingly spectral, distant, silent, yet omnipresent. Citizens no longer heard him often, but his absence itself became mystical proof of his transcendence. Rumors that he no longer slept, that he communed with destiny in isolation, spread through a population conditioned to see him as more than human. Goebbels perfected the art of ritualized despair. As the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, the ministry released statements describing the Western Front as the final trial, the Götterdämmerung, or Twilight of the Gods. This word, drawn from German mythology, encapsulated the regime's final propaganda phase, the belief that Germany's destruction would herald cosmic renewal. Instead of mobilizing optimism, Goebbels mobilized fatalism. If Germany must perish, he declared in one radio address, then the world shall perish with her. It was not strategy, but liturgy, a sermon of annihilation preached to a collapsing nation. The spiritualization of death now reached every aspect of daily life. The regime organized ceremonies for children who had lost parents in air raids, presenting them with medals as children of sacrifice. The Volkssturm, a militia of old men and boys formed in late 1944, was depicted as a sacred brotherhood rather than a desperate last measure. Propaganda posters showed them standing beneath beams of light, rifles in hand, eyes lifted heavenward. Their participation was not expected to bring victory. It was a collective confession of faith. Even the language of official communication became ritualistic. Goebbels' press releases avoided tactical details, instead invoking eternity and destiny. The enemy was always described as an unholy force, plutocratic, Bolshevik, materialist. Germany, by contrast, was pure spirit, misunderstood and persecuted. In this inversion, material defeat could coexist with moral victory. The people were urged to endure, to believe, to suffer in silence. By the winter of 1944 to 45, this faith had turned pathological. The radio announced miracle weapons as signs of divine intervention. The V-2 rockets were called messengers of fate. Newspapers described them as thunderbolts of justice sent from heaven. Even as cities burned, many citizens clung to this mythic hope. Propaganda no longer operated on reason, but on ritual expectation, the belief that, at the darkest hour, destiny itself would intercede. The regime had achieved the full transformation of war into religion, a belief system where destruction was redemption, death was triumph, and faith outlived reality itself. By early 1945, the Third Reich had entered its final delirious phase of self-destruction, yet propaganda continued to speak in the language of salvation. Goebbels' apparatus no longer operated as a ministry of information, but as a priesthood of denial. Every front collapsing, every city burning, every army annihilated was transfigured into a symbol of martyrdom. The regime preached that Germany's suffering would cleanse the world and ensure its rebirth in eternity. The line between religion and politics, already erased, dissolved completely into a cult of death. The destruction of Dresden in February 1945 provided a final, tragic opportunity for the regime to renew its narrative. The annihilation of tens of thousands of civilians was presented not as defeat, but as ritual immolation. Newspapers and radio described Dresden as a sacrifice upon the altar of history, a city offered to purify Europe from its sins. The visual imagery of ruins and fire echoed biblical cataclysms. Goebbels compared the flames to the judgment of destiny, proclaiming that Germany, though reduced to ashes, would rise again like the phoenix. In a nation collapsing, language itself became an instrument of liturgy, transforming horror into transcendence. Hitler's public appearances had ceased, but his image persisted as that of an ascetic prophet. The propaganda ministry distributed his final photographs and radio messages as sacred relics. When his voice was broadcast for the last time on January 30th, 1945, commemorating the 12th anniversary of his rise to power, it was delivered with the tone of divine revelation. "The German people will never capitulate," he declared, and Goebbels framed the speech as a testament of faith, urging citizens to commit themselves to the eternal fight of the soul. Even as reality dissolved, the narrative demanded belief in the unseen, in the inevitability of resurrection through annihilation. In the ruins of Berlin, the propaganda system persisted with mechanical precision. Loudspeakers broadcast hymns, patriotic songs, and edited battlefield reports long after communications with the front had collapsed. Civilians hiding in basements listened to news bulletins describing heroic resistance and miraculous recoveries. In April 1945, when Soviet troops entered the city, state radio continued to proclaim that Berlin remained invincible. To the very end, the regime sought to preserve the illusion of divine mission. In one of his final speeches, Goebbels told a gathering of officials, "We are not losing this war, we are fulfilling prophecy." Within the Volkssturm and remnants of the Wehrmacht, propaganda had achieved full transformation into dogma. Boys of 15 and men of 60 marched under banners reading "God is with us." Their commanders invoked destiny rather than tactics. Many believed sincerely that dying in defense of Berlin was a sacred obligation, not a military duty. Letters recovered from soldiers show a consistent tone of faith, not in victory, but in transcendence. "We fight for eternity," wrote one conscript from Pomerania. "Even if we fall, Germany will remain in God's memory." This fusion of nationalism and eschatology marked the final stage of Nazi propaganda's evolution, a religion of extinction. As Allied forces advanced, Goebbels' ministry retreated into fanaticism. The tone of official communications shifted from triumph to revelation, predicting a final miracle. Rumors circulated of secret weapons and divine interventions, from atomic energy to supernatural vengeance. The myth of Wunderwaffe, or miracle weapons, became the last form of faith. Goebbels and Hitler both encouraged it, not as deception, but as ritual necessity. The people had to believe in redemption, even if it required destruction of the material world. In the final days of April 1945, as Soviet artillery surrounded the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's bunker became the physical embodiment of the cult he had created. Inside, propaganda broadcasts continued on loudspeakers while the city outside burned. Hitler's final orders, dictations, and speeches were written in apocalyptic tone, calling for loyalty, sacrifice, and eternal remembrance. When he took his own life on April 30th, Goebbels immediately turned his death into the ultimate act of devotion. The announcement described the Führer as having fallen for Germany as a soldier of providence. His suicide was not framed as despair, but as fulfillment, the closing act of a sacred narrative. Goebbels followed the same path a day later, after arranging for his children to be killed. His final statements declared that faith will outlive us, and that the nation would rise again from its martyrdom. The propaganda ministry ceased transmission only when Soviet troops entered its offices. Even then, some local stations continued to broadcast recorded speeches for days, unaware that the Reich no longer existed. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, millions of citizens still clung to fragments of belief. Many refused to accept defeat until Allied troops physically arrived in their towns. The idea of divine destiny had survived beyond the regime itself, proving how deeply propaganda had reshaped reality. The war had ended, but its theology lingered, a faith without a god, sustained by ruin. In turning war into religion, the Nazi state had created a creed that could not imagine peace, only redemption through destruction. In the aftermath of defeat, the vast structure of Nazi propaganda collapsed, yet its spiritual residue remained deeply embedded in the German psyche. The unconditional surrender of May 1945 marked not only the military destruction of the Reich, but the disintegration of a worldview that had replaced politics with faith. For 12 years, millions had lived within a system where obedience was holiness, death was salvation, and the nation was divine. When this illusion vanished, it left behind a moral and psychological vacuum. Germany was not merely defeated, it had been spiritually disarmed. Allied occupation forces immediately recognized the depth of this indoctrination. The process of denazification had to go beyond punishing leaders or dismantling institutions. It required dismantling belief. Propaganda posters, films, and broadcasts were replaced by Allied newsreels showing concentration camps, destroyed cities, and the human cost of the war. The intention was not only to inform, but to shock Germans into moral awareness. However, many citizens reacted not with guilt, but with confusion. Having been told for years that they were the chosen people of destiny, they now faced images proving they were instruments of catastrophe. The collapse of faith left many unable to reconcile belief with reality. In 1945-46, Allied psychological experts studied the remnants of Nazi ideology among prisoners, teachers, and civilians. They found that the language of devotion persisted. Some still spoke of Hitler in past tense reverence, describing him as a tragic savior who had been betrayed. Others transferred their belief into fatalism, insisting that Germany's suffering was divine punishment meant to purify the nation. These patterns revealed that Nazi propaganda had not simply imposed ideas. It had restructured moral perception itself. People had learned to interpret every event as a manifestation of higher will. Even defeat was absorbed into this logic, becoming another act of destiny. Re-education programs sought to restore rational and civic thinking through media, schools, and art. American and British authorities used radio to reintroduce democratic principles, while newspapers like Die Neue Zeitung promoted factual reporting over ideology. Yet this transition was slow. The emotional dependency created by propaganda, the comfort of absolute certainty, could not be replaced easily. Many Germans, especially younger ones raised entirely within the Hitler Youth system, found post-war pluralism alien and disorienting. The rituals that once structured life, parades, oaths, songs, anniversaries, vanished overnight, leaving silence where meaning had once been imposed. In the ruins, churches experienced a sudden return of attendance, but their sermons often struggled to address the moral void. Some clergy interpreted the destruction of the Reich as divine judgment. Others sought reconciliation by emphasizing universal guilt. The Nazi regime had eroded traditional faith so thoroughly that for many, Christianity itself now seemed contaminated by its wartime complicity. The spiritual landscape of post-war Germany was fragmented. Faith in institutions had died, and yet the yearning for transcendence remained. What had been manipulated by propaganda as devotion to the Reich now reappeared as a desperate search for redemption. Former propagandists attempted to justify their actions by presenting themselves as artists or patriots. Goebbels' diaries, discovered after the war, revealed the extent to which he believed his own illusions. He had not seen himself as a deceiver, but as a believer fulfilling destiny. This self-perception reflected a broader truth. Propaganda had worked precisely because those who spread it often shared the faith they demanded. Their sincerity made the system more powerful and more resistant to collapse. After the war, this sincerity also made denazification psychologically complex. Many individuals could not admit guilt because they had never recognized their participation as moral choice, only as obedience to history. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in late 1945, confronted this fusion of ideology and religion directly. Prosecutors presented films of atrocities alongside speeches and directives from the propaganda ministry, arguing that words had been weapons. The courtroom became a symbolic reversal of the Nazi worldview: reason against revelation, evidence against faith. Goebbels himself was absent, having died by suicide, but his speeches echoed through the proceedings. The trials revealed how language could sanctify violence, how metaphors of purity, destiny, and sacrifice could erase human boundaries. The moral lesson extracted from Nuremberg was not only political, but theological. When faith is detached from conscience, it becomes a tool of destruction. In the following years, as Germany rebuilt under occupation and later as a divided state, the memory of Nazi propaganda faded from public discussion, but persisted subconsciously. The spectacle of total belief had inoculated many against future ideologies, yet the same emotional hunger that had sustained the Reich did not disappear. It resurfaced in different forms: nationalism, anti-communism, existential despair. For decades, scholars, theologians, and artists tried to understand how a modern, educated society could transform war into religion. The answer lay not in madness, but in method: the deliberate sanctification of politics through myth, ritual, and emotion. By 1949, with the establishment of the Federal Republic, Germany began to rebuild a civic identity grounded in skepticism rather than the faith. The propaganda machine that once united millions in worship of the Führer was now studied as a warning, evidence of how belief could be engineered. Yet even as new generations emerged, the traces of that engineered faith lingered in memory, reminding the world that propaganda's greatest power is not to deceive, but to make people worship their own destruction. The legacy of Nazi propaganda endured long after the last radio broadcast faded and the banners were torn down. What remained was not merely the record of manipulation, but the memory of how easily modern society could turn politics into faith. Historians, psychologists, and theologians spent decades dissecting the mechanisms that had transformed the Third Reich into a spiritual empire. They concluded that its strength lay not in fear alone, but in meaning, the promise of belonging, destiny, and transcendence. The Nazi regime had offered its citizens something few political systems ever could: the illusion of eternal purpose. In the decades following 1945, this realization shaped the study of mass communication, psychology, and religion alike. Scholars such as Theodor Adorno and Hannah Arendt warned that totalitarianism was not only a political phenomenon, but a moral one, a perversion of faith. The Nazi system had replaced God with ideology, the church with the state, and prayer with ritualized obedience. In doing so, it demonstrated how the symbols of devotion could be stripped of ethics and turned into instruments of domination. The architecture of propaganda, parades, flags, slogans, synchronized voices, revealed that modernity had not erased humanity's religious instincts. It had only redirected them. The spiritual transformation of war under the Third Reich also changed how future generations understood conflict. The myth of the Holy War did not die in 1945. It evolved into a cautionary memory. The images of torchlit rallies, banners rising like altars, and soldiers marching under the sign of destiny became universal symbols of collective delusion. In post-war Germany, schools and universities began teaching critical thinking and media literacy precisely to prevent the resurrection of such faith. The message was clear: propaganda is most dangerous when it stops looking like persuasion and starts feeling like revelation. In art and cinema, attempts to confront this past revealed the difficulty of separating aesthetics from ideology. Filmmakers who studied Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph des Willens saw in its beauty a moral paradox, a masterpiece of form in service of evil. The same visual language that once glorified unity and discipline had become a warning about submission and blindness. Artists of the post-war avant-garde rejected grandeur altogether, embracing dissonance, fragmentation, and irony as antidotes to the seductive harmony of propaganda. Germany's rebuilt cities, stripped of fascist monuments, reflected the same aesthetic humility: functionality replacing monumentality, silence replacing spectacle. Religious thinkers, too, were forced to reconsider their role in society. Many clergy had either collaborated or remained silent during the Reich, and the Church's entanglement with state ideology demanded introspection. Theologians began to explore how the language of salvation could be twisted into the language of power. Some argued that faith itself had to be rebuilt on doubt, humility, and conscience rather than obedience. This theological reckoning became a moral foundation for the new Europe, a continent determined to remember how faith, once fused with nationalism, could justify the unthinkable. At the same time, former propagandists and artists of the Reich left behind an extensive archive of techniques that would influence modern advertising, political campaigns, and media design. The synchronization of message and image, the control of emotion through rhythm and repetition, and the blending of aesthetics with the ideology became subjects of both fascination and fear. In the emerging Cold War, both East and West adopted aspects of these methods, proving that the legacy of total persuasion had not vanished but evolved. What had once served tyranny now shaped democracy's own struggle for attention and loyalty. For the German people, confronting the memory of propaganda became an ongoing national ritual. Memorials and museums dedicated to the victims of Nazism also functioned as reminders of the machinery that made their persecution possible. The phrase "never again" referred not only to genocide, but to the conditions that enabled it, the collective faith in myths stronger than truth. Over time, this awareness gave rise to a new kind of patriotism rooted in skepticism, a civic religion of remembrance. In it, the act of questioning became the highest form of loyalty to democracy. The story of how Nazi propaganda turned war into a religion is ultimately a study of human vulnerability. It reveals how the hunger for meaning can eclipse reason, how spectacle can replace thought, and how belief, once detached from moral responsibility, can sanctify destruction. The Third Reich's propaganda system demonstrated that modern technology, radio, film, architecture, and print could be used not only to inform, but to consecrate. The regime built cathedrals of light and temples of sound, transforming the instruments of progress into tools of worship. And when the faith it inspired demanded blood, millions obeyed without hesitation. In the end, the true danger of such propaganda lies not in its lies but in its truths, in the emotional realities it creates and the certainties it promises. The Nazi experiment proved that even in an age of science and modernity, humanity's longing for transcendence could be weaponized. The war it sanctified destroyed the world that birthed it, leaving behind a single enduring lesson. When nations begin to believe that history itself speaks with divine authority, the result is not salvation, but catastrophe. The ruins of the Reich remain silent now, yet the echoes of its sermons still resonate, reminders that faith, when stripped of conscience, can make any ideology sacred and any war holy.